We're facing a wicked problem of a rapidly changing climate, and our ecology is crumbling around us. So the concept of degrowth is a really exciting thing to watch develop. To see this idea, this movement that has the potential to offer real transformative change is great. I really like the practical aspects, like how labour could be transformed with a short working week, or common sense tech solutions like getting rid of planned obsolescence. It's easy to do, just engineer goods to last longer. That's great, but it's almost surreal that we're not doing these things already. Well, as we theorise about adaptation, there's a recognition how grim it is going to be for many people and places around the world and in the global south. We also have a global south that is situated in the north, and by this I mean our own poor or marginalised communities in the Western world. Like in Wales and across the rest of the UK, there are people right now who are feeling the brunt of the climate and the ecological emergency. So if greenhouse gas emissions, and especially carbon, continues to accumulate in the atmosphere, a warming world will not be a good place. As for ecology demise, which doesn't often receive enough attention, that has the potential to be even more devastating to a livable and a safe future. By the way, if I say climate, I mean to include ecological problems too. So degrowth proponents, they say it's a planned reduction of excess, and it's aimed at bringing change to society. That it's a response to concerns about how we are swallowing up resources of a limited planet. It's about reversing rampant growth as measured by GDP, which, because of how it's constructed, has an insatiable and never-ending need for expansion. So degrowth is great, as within the idea there's a distinct anti-capitalist approach, and there's a feminist strand which makes it appear quite rounded. I've got Jason Hickel's new book, which is subtitled How Degrowth Will Save the World. This is quite a bold statement, not least because the world is multifaceted and it's varied. So to fully realise its potential, we must critique and unpack what degrowth is saying, so we are aware of where the movement sits in a wider scope of interconnectedness. Will it really save the world? The question that I would put to degrowth is, whose world is it aiming to save? To help with this question, let's consider our comforts, us here in the Western world, our needs, our securities and enjoyments are subsidised by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. And this is over both time and space. It's what Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek calls systemic violence, the catastrophic effects of economic and political systems. And in systemic violence, intentions become secondary to outcome. So our intention to satisfy our own comforts and needs becomes secondary to the outcome that our comforts are gained at someone else's expense. It means that getting rid of oppression in areas which are exploited for our needs should be paramount in our efforts to halt the climate emergency. So how will degrowth contribute to this? Systemic violence is not due to a lack of understanding and awareness, but it's to a modern colonial mindset in the mainstream. Our so-called developed societies have been built at the expense of colonised nations, and it seems that we in the West don't want to give that up quickly. Our actions drive us towards maintaining the status quo. It's business as usual. But in a telecoupled world, impacts in one locality affect another. If we want low-impact tech like solar panels and electric vehicles, the materials to build them with must be gotten from somewhere, and the capitalist system provides a way. Things like biofuels are driving land grabs across Africa. Olufemi Taiwo, an American academic, tells us that investors and hedge funds fleeing the financial crash of 2007 and 2008 grabbed 25% of available agricultural land in Africa for biofuels and for other cash crops. What about cobalt, which is needed for electric vehicle batteries? But we know right now that human rights abuses connected to it are taking place in the Congo, in other places. But the show must go on. We have to decarbonise at all costs. So what this gives us is an opportunity to see how this new movement intersects with social justice and whether it can be a catalyst for environmental justice. Degrowth has roots as a Western concept that must integrate with justice movements and activism outside of the Western bubble. At the moment, actors in the global south are suggesting this needs much more serious consideration. We need to think about it a lot more before it moves further. There is talk that degrowth is a continuation of a Euro-centred hegemony, that it's neo-colonial in not considering environmental justice matters elsewhere, and is even reproducing heteropatriarchal patterns. So what am I implying? I'll try and show you by first considering how the language and ideas used in degrowth, how that discourse attracts attention and it attracts contention. So I'm going to show you a definition. I'll put a slide up from the Research in Degrowth, which is an academic association quite central to lots of the thinking and drive behind the movement. It's the definition of degrowth. And there's a few words of interest in the definition that I want to just point out. Like downscaling or consumption, living within means, equally distributed, cultural imaginary, frugally. All of these words, they expose the global north's hegemony within a dialogue on solutions, ignoring the reality of liberation struggles. It seems it's about who holds the power in the relationship, and there is a definite feel of a neo-colonial aspect. This definition seeks to dominate discussion about how the West responds to a problem of its own making, without considering collaborative or consultative engagement and dialogue. Without doubt, and what is an absolute necessity, the West must address its own systems, like the unequal structure of an international trade and the doctrine of continuous growth, which, by the way, have their roots in imperial colonialism. But we have to look through a very clear lens at the whole picture, not just our own problems. It's not just degrowth under scrutiny, but the whole global system. There's some work by Rodriguez Lebajos and others, which takes an exploratory approach of informed rapprochement. Rapprochement just means bringing together. It's collaborative research, and it was done to think about things like the power dynamics that are sort of centred in degrowth. So we've got committed people from Western academia, organisers, together with academics and activists from the South. They all took part in this work. And basically what Rodriguez Lebajos talks she talks to proponents on both sides to discuss where the sticking points are and where there's problems with degrowth. And I'm going to go through some here, which sort of link to my critique that the definition mentioned earlier is Eurocentric. Look, take language first. It says in the definition, to concentrate on new social arrangements to live frugally. Look, starvation's a negative impact caused by climate water stress. It's an example. It's caused by drought or floods. They destroy food. It's insensitive to insist on frugal living when many in the South are already doing that or are living hand to mouth, reluctantly. It's like telling a subsistence farmer whose crops have just been inundated that she has to suck it up. This is the new solution to climate change, matey, frugal living. How can we say this to these victims of people who are suffering from more frequent and stronger storms, like the residents of the 9th Ward in New Orleans? You know, they're still reeling and living frugally 16 years after Hurricane Katrina in the United States of America. There's another phrase that stood out. Creating beautiful poor spaces. I think that one's particularly insensitive. In Ghana, my parents' home country, 50% of infant mortality is due to inadequate sanitation. Not having a toilet is not a beautiful poor space, either metaphorically or in reality. And attached to language is also the terminology and the phrasing used. So time's often mentioned. Yet many cultures don't view time as linear. We therefore need to apply a decolonising of methodology to it. Degrowth it proposes such measures as energy sufficiency. How can you scale back to be energy sufficient if you have none already? Remember, energy is one of the main components, along with concrete and steel, of development. So it ignores the contraction and convergence argument of polluter pays. Those least responsible have the least resource to pay for climate damage, and arguably, they have a right to develop a reasonable lifestyle. Does degrowth deny them energy access? Energy provision's mentioned a lot, but what about ownership and control of the factors of generation or production? Who owns the scale projects? Who finances the investment in new renewables? Should they even be financed, or should they be built using the gift economy or barter trade? And lastly on this, energy and fuel poverty are already an issue for many, even in Wales. So the same arguments carry to the global south, in the north, so to speak. Some of the contributors to Rodriguez Lebajos' research are from the EJOLT activist movement. It's a collaboration of environmental justice groups and campaigns from places like Nigeria, from Ecuador, Kenya, Brazil, and many others. And what they claim is that degrowth is not radical enough for them. They say it needs to be more anti-capitalist, and they cite their own campaigns like leave the oil in the soil, leave the coal in the hole, leave the tar sands in the land, which are suggested as projects to learn from. And these projects, they're about environmental justice, that's what they have at their heart, but they're also staunchly anti-capitalist. There's also some discussion about eco-socialism, which I think you need to go and explore that. That's your homework. I'd like to add that I have a really uncomfortable feeling about degrowth as one particular part of it, something which has also been pointed out by feminist scholars, Nebel and Rochelot, that it has an aura of being about individual action, which I suppose is derived from this overarching neoliberal mentality of people in the West. After 4 or so decades of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, it's a really hard yoke to break free of. We need to be really careful with that. So, all in all, what I'd say is that these things illustrate the Eurocentricity of the degrowth concept. It's basically an approach centred on Western developed countries. What we must do is ensure an exchange of ideas, of thought and discussion to build understanding in a pluriversal world. Neither can we ignore historical and contemporary struggles for justice. We need to explore how degrowth can work in collaboration and alongside other world movements. Most importantly, those movements working for justice and liberation. Degrowth would do well to think about abolition ecology and eco-socialism. So I'm not an expert on that, but maybe we can ask Scott for comment. Abolition ecology, it's about countering both class and race bias. And when I talk about it, I refer to Nick Hanen's work and his considerations of how racialized capitalism is entrenched in our system of political ecology, that it's exploitative and it causes unequal racial development. But I also want to emphasize not to focus on a victim culture for oppressed people or for oppressed communities, that we look at how abolition ecology gives us tools for place building, that it's a praxis of resistance, and it's about creating or maintaining well-being using knowledge and skills that are indigenous, that are traditional or that are contemporary. Thankfully, collaboration and discussion is taking place between justice actors and organisers in the Global South and the degrowth proponents. And I just want to add, not just in degrowth, it's really important in all aspects of our work on sustainability to be aware of intersectional justice matters when thinking about any form. Appropriation of the global atmospheric commons, that's another aspect of neo-colonialism, which the degrowth campaign in the North and the social justice movements in the Global South both seek to change, to amend for the better, but from different angles or locations, like a pincer movement. And what I really like is an analogy from the decolonial feminist Nikita Dhawan, who portrays the Global South and degrowth, their goals, as similar to riding in different boats. They're both being bashed by different waves whilst needing different outcomes to weather the same great tempest. And what Dhawan is saying is that in a carbon-constrained world, we must all work together for the same ends, but we often have to do so in pluriversally different ways that avoid systemic violence. So degrowth, it really does contain a fruit that once ripe can both repair harm and that's also emancipatory. And we know from research, including my own CAT dissertation, that the intersections of oppression for the black community in the UK often ignores that environmentalism is broadly universal. Yet exclusion and racism continue to hold back integration and collaboration. I can't emphasize enough my fear that if we fail to break down systemic inequality, we will not achieve implementation of solutions, whether that's degrowth or anything else. This is as true in the West as it is in the Global South. No one must be left behind, and no solution should bring further harm. If it only centres a certain portion of the global family, it's continuing a cycle of systemic violence. So environmental justice, climate justice, and fighting the climate and ecological emergency cannot be done in isolation. Social and environmental solutions are not separate. They are one and the same. So there's many places around the world that want to break the yoke of historical and new forms of colonialism and racial capitalism. What they want, what they desire, is restored indigeneity and self-determination. They call for well-being, health and education, but of their own choosing. So these marginalised, they wish for an escape from the yoke of settler colonialism. This self-determination could and should be their own to interpret and deploy. Now, it may include some form of what we call development and a reclaiming of their own local commons. But if countries in Africa, say, or in Asia wish to develop, the issue for degrowth is how we ask them to forego development in the name of a problem they did not create. So there is some evidence in the literature, Gutowski et al., others, that no country has ever developed, I mean developed as per Western Europe, USA standards, no country has developed without industrialising. And that in itself can draw in its wake an increase in resource use and the emergence of a consumer economy, which are both contrary, I suppose, to the intended outcomes of degrowth. As for what counts for development, how it's defined, that's a different question which we won't go into here. So, Omnia Sunt Communia, all things in common. It's a Latin saying, it means all things are held in common. So this work that degrowth is doing is not exactly new thinking. The use of the concept, especially of the commons, it's been around for a while. The work of Massimo De Angelis is well worth looking at when we think of degrowth. He's looked at how social movements around the world are approaching the commons as a tool for post-capital and an anti-growth society. Essentially, the commons are not just tangible, like a local pasture or lammas land where you can graze your animals free, but they're also social, they're also family, the community and food networks. It's community organising, which is community-based social organising, which, as De Angelis says, has multicultures of horizontality. So he's a UEL person, by the way. So there's a connection to Cat. Maybe we could get his comment on degrowth in this respect. I'm going to wrap up shortly, but I'm going to repeat my mantra that societal aims should be about well-being, not just growth. I'm sure we all agree on that. There can and should be new measures of development like furthering the happiness index, but self-determination for communities is a key aspect of it all. And as I said, in my own research with the Black community of the UK, I looked at their perception of environment, found it's broadly universal. Whatever your heritage background, black or white, we all have the same concerns. But it was a surprise that I found exclusion and systemic or institutional racism as the major stumbling blocks. No surprise. It's a stumbling block for them taking more pro-environmentally responsible behaviours. However, what was unlooked for, and here's a message possibly for degrowth, I uncovered suggestions for solutions put forward by the community, and they came about, I think, because of the rich historical legacy that heritage groups hold on to. And interesting to me, for people that for far too long have been subject to oppression, themes of solution were very evident, with many ideas relating to natural altruism and to how they occur in communities, supportive communities. There were suggestions for how we should be harnessing this already strong community cohesion and the support structures that exist in African and Caribbean descent communities, using that to challenge climate change, challenge ecology demise. But what we see is neoliberal individualism that may sit with some of our elites, but at a grassroots level, community and family is still really strong and it's really resourceful. Black people have lived existentially for hundreds of years because we have had to internalise support as a survival tactic. Now, I found a sense of positivity around adaptation, which was really reassuring. Yes, our house has been burning for centuries, but we have strong indicators of resilience that are driven by this intersection of oppression, and it gives us strength for how we resist. I'm going to ask, how can this ethos be incorporated into the degrowth movement in Western societies? So a thing to think about is the black radical tradition that's espoused by Cedric Robinson. And it explains that revolution by the enslaved people was not in response to the colonial masters, nor was it about reacting to a brutality of white supremacy. If we say this, we're just giving agency to the violence of abuse, and that centres the abuser. Revolution, Robinson says, was already inherent in the lives of free Africans before they were captured and enslaved. The essence of a people is their capacity before colonialism, their cultures and their synergy with the land and the environment, key points. This is what we should allude to when we speak about revolution. Decolonising is a restoring of that indigeneity to a position that represents us before capitalist imperialism and is what we must draw upon to work out how degrowth can work alongside social and justice movements in a pluriversal drive against extraction and oppressions. And I'll just finish by saying the absence of the African contribution or comment on degrowth is really noticeable in its absence. And thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.